Good day, I am Rosemary D. Rizabal from BSBA MM2B. In this video, I will be discussing different kinds of obligation. First, according to plurality of subject, single, joint, and solidary. Number 2, classification according to performance, divisible and indivisible. Number 3, classification according to sanction of breach, with penal clause and no penal clause. Article 1207. The concurrence of two or more creditors or of two or more debtors in one and the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has the right to demand, or that each one of the latter is bound to render. Enter compliance with the prestation. There is a solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states, or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. So it talks about joint and solidary obligation. But before we proceed, let's define first the single or individual obligation, collective obligation. Under this, we have joint and solidary. Always remember in joint the word to each his own. And in solidary, always remember this word, one for all for one. When we say single or individual obligation, the creditor and the debtor is only one. This contrasts in collective obligation, wherein there are two or more debtors and creditors. Now, what is joint obligation? In here, each debtor answers only one part of a whole. When each obligee belongs only part of collective rights, always remember here to each his own. Kung ano lang ang share, part or portion, yun lang ang right or obligation niya. While solidary obligation, each of the creditor may demand fulfillment for the whole obligation. In here, always remember the word one for all for one. Example. Maria and Laura are joint debtors of Rose of an amount of 2 million pesos. So Rose can demand only 1 million to Maria and another 1 million to Laura because it is joint. Now let's use the first example as solidary obligation. Maria and Laura are solidary debtors of Rose of an amount of 2 million pesos. Like what I've said when we say solidary, one for all for one. That's why Rose can demand here the whole 2 million pesos in any of her solidary debtors, which is Maria and Laura. Suppose that only Maria who gave the whole 2 million pesos to Rose. So what is the right of Maria because he pays the whole 2 million pesos in Rose? So, Maria can ask reimbursement to Laura in which amount of 1 million pesos, which is the only share of Laura. Another kind of obligation, classification according to performance, divisible and indivisible. Article 1223, the divisibility or indivisibility of the things that are the object of the obligation in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. This provision talks about the visibility and indivisibility of the things that are the object of the obligation. So, what is divisible and indivisible obligation? Let me define first divisible obligation. From the word itself, divisible, meaning it is capable in partial fulfillment. For example, to deliver a 100 kilos of coffee. It is divisible because it is capable in partial fulfillment. While in the other hand, indivisible obligation when it is not capable for partial fulfillment. For example, to deliver a specific bag. As simple as that. Now how about kinds of division? Number 1, quantitative. From the word itself, quantitative. So meaning it is depend on the quantity. Example, Maria and Laura divides 4 kilos of mango. So how is the division of each part? By kilo, tig 2 kilo or by quantity. Number 2, qualitative. In here, the division of the object is by quality. Example, by hairs or yung mana. Maria, Laura, and Rose hairs the property of land of their father who passed away year ago. Maria hairs the land, Laura the house, Rose is the car. They agreed to divide their inheritance by the kind of division by quality, not quantity. Number 3, intellectual or moral. It is one which consists of exists only in the minds of parties. There is no actual separation of division, only in the minds of both parties. Test for distinction. In determining whether the obligation is divisible or not, the controlling circumstance is the purpose of the obligation or the intention of the parties. Note, an obligation is presumed indivisible where there is only one creditor and only one debtor. Questions. Does Article 1123 only refers on applicable in real obligation, meaning in obligation to give only, not on the obligation to do or not to do? Because when you read the article, it seems like it fixes only with the thing. The word is used in its broad sense of meaning. It is actually referring to an object or prestation of the obligation, which may be delivered a thing or render some service. So obligation which is by nature are susceptible for partial performance. Example, payment of debts on installment basis, so its nature it is divisible. Let's have a recap. Divisible and indivisible obligation have nothing to do with the object of prestation. The misconception here is if the object of the prestation is divisible, magiging divisible din yung obligation. No, obligation is depend upon the rule that we discussed. Example, if Rose is supposed to deliver 1,000 kilos of flour, this does not mean Rose can deliver the flour in an installment. The object of the prestation is divisible, which is 1,000 kilos of flour, but then they agreed that it will be delivered as whole at once, so it will become indivisible. Does not necessarily follow if the object is divisible. It will automatically become divisible obligation. Even though the object is physically divisible, the obligation is indivisible if it is provided by the law or intended by the parties. Now, before we forget the last paragraph, divisibility or indivisibility of an obligation not to do. So, in negative obligation not to do, the character of the prestation in each particular case shall determine their divisibility or indivisibility. Article 1224. Joint indivisible obligation gives rise to indemnity for damages from the time any one of the debtor does not comply with his undertaking. The debtors who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to the indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the things or of the value of the service in which the obligation consists. Article 1124 discusses the effect of non-compliance by debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. If one of the debtor in joint indivisible obligation who cannot comply of their obligation, the obligation transforms into damages in form of money. Article 1124 said, the debtor who may have been ready to fulfill their promises shall not contribute to indemnity beyond the corresponding portion of the price of the things of the value of the service in which the obligation consists. So meaning, the innocent debtor shall not contribute beyond their respective share of obligation because it's unfair. he is after all ready and willing to comply with his obligation. So, meaning the obligation becomes indivisible at once. Now let's compare it with the solidary obligation. The break of the co-debtor makes all the debtor liable to all damages. The obligation remains solidary without the prejudice of their rights against the guilty negligent debtor. That's why one for all for one. In terms of obligation and liability or damages of one another who breach their obligation. If one of the debtor cannot comply with their obligation, automatic they are all liable to damages of one, although they have the right to go against their negligent or guilty debtor. So, this is unlike to joint indivisible obligation. Article 1225. For the purposes of the preceding articles, obligation to give definite things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance shall be deemed to be indivisible. When the obligation has for its object the execution of a certain number of days or work, the accomplishment of work by metrical units, or analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, it shall be divisible. However, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, an obligation is indivisible, if so provided by law or intended by the parties. In obligation not to do, divisibility or indivisibility shall be determined by the character of the prestation in each particular case. So, Article 1225 talks about the rules on how to determine if it is indivisible or divisible obligation. I think we are all settled on the rule that the purpose of the obligation is the controlling circumstance for determining if the obligation is divisible or not divisible. These rules not only apply in obligation to give but also to obligation to do and not to do. So what are the object which is divisible or not indivisible? Ano nga ba ang sabi ng Article 1125? So paragraph 1 and 3 talks about indivisible obligation while paragraph 2 talks about divisible obligation. So, paragraph 1, we have two situations. First is the obligation to give definite things and it is indivisible. Example, to deliver a specific bag. It is definite thing, so meaning it is indivisible. And the second, on the paragraph 1, is the obligation which is susceptible for partial performance. So, the example here is to render a dance. It cannot be on a partial. Here, the obligation is indivisible by reason of its purpose, which requires of a performance of all its parts. But we have a question. Does the obligation still indivisible if there are more than one participant? So, if the situation is like that, the obligation is divisible as far as the participants are concerned. Let's proceed with the third paragraph. That will talks about what is deemed indivisible obligation. It is said also, even though the object or service may be physically divisible, the obligation is indivisible if so provided by law or intended by the parties. We have another two scenarios here in paragraph 3, where it is deemed indivisible obligation, and one of these is when the obligation is so provided by the law to be indivisible. Example, payment of tax. Under the law, tax should be paid within a definite period, so although money is physically divisible, the amount of tax payable must be delivered as a whole. On the payment of tax, we should pay it as a whole, not by partial. Example, the obligation of Laura to give 2,000 pesos to Maria on that certain date. Obviously, the money is divisible, but then the intention of the parties is to give the full amount of 2,000 pesos at once or as a whole. So it will become indivisible. So let's go back on the second paragraph. It discusses the obligation which is deemed divisible. So first, when the obligation has for its object the execution of certain number of days of work. It is simple as when the laborer is hired to work for 10 days. Another scenario, the shows deems divisible. The accomplishment of work by metric units. So, example, when the laborer is hired to construct a street 3 meter wide by 50 meter long, like that, so by metric units. Another deemed divisible, analogous things which by the nature are susceptible or the partial performance.